Hello everybody, welcome to the County Seat. I'm your host Chad Booth. As we approach the end of the year, we decided that we would step back and take a look at the organization that represents the counties of Utah, whom we in a video fashion or as in television fashion also represent. So joining me today for our show is Brent Gardner, the Executive Director at the Utah Association of Counties. Brent, good to have you with us.
Thank you, Chad. It's good to be here.
I think we should really start by just talking about how important UAC is to the counties, because basically, prior to my involvement in this show, I thought the Utah Association of Counties was basically a commissioners group, but it's really much broader than that.
Yes, it is. We represent 29 counties. They're officially the members of our organization, but as part of that, of course, we represent all of their elected officials as well as their appointed officials. So we have a pretty large group and functions very well. And most people don't really know much about county government, let alone about an organization that represents county government. So that's kind of where we fit in.
What kind of services do you provide?
Well, our main function would be to represent their interests at the state legislature and at the federal government level. So every year as the legislature meets, they usually have to deal with around 12 to 1,400 pieces of legislation. Probably 30% of those have some impact on county government, whether it be law enforcement, elections, health issues, road issues, tax issues, human service issues. All of those are issues that county government has primary responsibility for at the state level. And so the counties have an interest in making sure that legislation is drafted in such a way that it allows them to function the way they need to function and provides the resources they need to do the job.
Do you ever find that the legislature, instead of looking at counties as part of a team, as a subset of the state, sometimes becomes a little bit adversarial with them?
Yeah, I think that is a problem that we face. Rather than viewing counties as an arm of the state, which they frequently like to remind us of when it's, you know, in their interest to remind us and say in tax issues or something, we oftentimes feel like they're viewing us more as just a special interest group that's out there trying to get the state to fund something they don't really want to fund. And that's unfair in a way because many of the services that are provided by county governments are mandated by the legislature for the counties to provide them. So if they're going to force the counties to provide the services, they need to also review the manner in which those services are provided and fundamentally and provide the resources that are necessary for us to get the job done.
Kind of like a kicking the can down the road sometimes.
Yeah, a little bit like that.
They don't want to own what has to be done, so they let the counties do the dirty work.
Yeah. Well, and you can understand there's 104 legislators, and many of them come in and out of the legislature quickly, don't have a lot of background to local government, let alone counties. So it takes an effort for us to educate them on those issues.
What other sorts of services do you provide?
Well, a lot of our services are tied to legislative issues. We have a lot of training, the convention that you mentioned, conferences and meetings. We do probably 15 or 20 meetings throughout the year. And a lot of those meetings are centered around getting legislative issues put together, review them, take positions on them, develop information that we can feed back to the legislature. And then a large number of those meetings are centered around just professional development. How do we make sure that county officials and employees are performing their jobs at the highest level? So we try to provide training for them.
Well, I guess basically because elections are open to anyone, sometimes you get somebody who gets elected to an office and, like Robert Redford said in The Candidate, now what do I do?
Exactly. Yeah, we have a lot of that occur. They don't understand what county government is, and then a lot of times when they're faced with the responsibility, they feel like they have a lot more authority than they really have. And so it's kind of a shock sometimes to figure out that I've got this one little piece and I really have to go to the legislature a lot of times and ask, Mother, may I do something that I feel like I need to do, or I certainly have to review the statute to understand the parameters under which I function as an elected official.
Well, that's excellent. We are going to continue our conversation with Brent Gardner about the Utah Association of Counties and some of the accomplishments of the organization throughout the years. We'll be right back with the County Seat.
The Morgan Area Chamber of Commerce presents 50 Things to Do in Morgan, the Browning Outlet Store. Browning clothes and other hunting gear at outlet prices. Snow skiing. Snow Basin is a world-class resort offering great terrain, breathtaking vistas, and that famous Utah powder. photography of trains, scenery, and wildlife. Come see why Morgan, with its rustic train bridges and abundant wildlife, is a destination for photographers. Sledding. Morgan has lots of great hills and soft powder. Ice fishing. Morgan has 2 great reservoirs to fish, East Canyon and Lost Creek. Old Time Christmas. An old-fashioned hometown Christmas celebration complete with the largest nativity in Utah. To learn more or find more activities in Morgan, visit gomorgan.org. Morgan County, easy to work, healthy to live.
How would you spend an extra day in Utah Valley? Stay one more day. Visit utahvalley.com to make reservations. Utah Valley. Bring everyone together.
The State of Utah School and Institutional Trust Lands Administration, SITLA, manages 3.5 million acres of Utah lands with the express purpose of providing financial support to further the education of Utah's students, while promoting local industry, oil and gas, even residential development, all at the same time. Through the careful use of trust lands, the School Land Trust Program will distribute nearly $37 million to Utah schools this year. The State of Utah School and Institutional Trust Lands Administration, building the state's permanent school fund.
Welcome back to the county seat. We are talking today with Brent Gardner, the Chief Executive Officer of the Utah Association of Counties. We've kind of gone over what the basic function of the organization is. So let's start from January of last year to now and talk about the accomplishments of UAC.
A lot of those are ongoing still. For example, one of the major issues that we've been involved in throughout the year is the prison relocation effort the state has undergone. That's a big issue for county government. 24, 25 counties operate county jails and have contracts with the state to house state prisoners. If the state prison is relocated, one of the big questions, of course, is how big is that new facility going to be? How many of those prisoners in that facility will be contracted out to the county? So we've been very active in that. Highway funding is a major issue. It's been 16, 17 years since counties and local governments received any kind of funding increase to maintain roads. That's a long time given the price escalation on the materials and of course the personnel that you have to pay. So we've been engaged in trying to get some kind of highway revenue increased. We're always engaged in human services issues. Medicaid expansion is one of the issues that our groups follow very closely, has an impact on our human service responsibilities as well as on our incarceration functions. Tax issues. We're trying to deal with one of the interim committees that has taken up the cause about eliminating an August Truth and Taxation hearing, which we find to be very unproductive because it's well into the tax year and you can't really alter a budget 8 months into the year. So we're trying to find an alternative to have to go through a second hearing, which seems to be meaningless. We're constantly involved in election issues. Same-day registration is an issue that came up last year that our clerks have been working on. Public land issues involving what's going to happen with some of the responsibilities that counties have when they maintain and provide services to the state. So all of those issues are ongoing.
Do we have any real successes last year? You know, like something that you've been working on that you finally got nailed and put to bed?
We have an ongoing funding issue with jails that we have always, for the last many years, dealt with, which is condition probation inmates that are placed in county jails. We haven't really got it nailed down yet, but we got another step in funding that, another $1 million. So we're at 12 out of 16, so we're getting closer and closer.
Do you ever sometimes think that the state legislature isn't that much different than Washington?
Yeah, for us it seems pretty difficult for the legislature to feel like they don't like the federal government mandating expenditures and services, and yet they turn around and do the same thing on counties. And we're not sure why the message doesn't translate from one level to the other, but oftentimes it doesn't. And so, yeah, it is frustrating.
Do you ever have any kind of idea or or measuring stick to figure out how long a project's going to take if it's multi-year?
Not in a formal way, but we certainly have a tracking sheet that has our legislation listed on it, and we track very closely some 30 to 40 pieces of legislation. Out of those 30 or 40, we can easily get half or more checked off where they're passed and done and finished. Larger issues, of course, do take multi-year, and we do try to alert our members that, hey, you've brought an issue to us, we'll work on this, but we're certainly letting you know that we think this is going to be multi-year before we have a result to it. So we do try to put them on notice when they bring something to us that's very complicated and difficult to get done.
Do you guys ever do the victory slap when you finally get it
Oh
finished?
yeah. Usually it's a jump up and down and shout hooray, but yeah, we take our time when we need to celebrate at the end of a session.
That's good, that's good. We'll be right back with more of the county seat. We're going to take a look back over the long haul and see how the counties and UAC have made their mark on the world over a 3-decade period. We'll be right back with the county seat.
Kanab, base camp for your southern Utah adventures. You belong in Kanab.
Get ready, set, jump. The day starts off at sunrise with the Cisco Disco. Come catch Cisco fish at Cisco Beach on the east side of Bear Lake. After the fishing, why not jump in the lake yourself? The Bear Lake Monster Polar Plunge starts at 11 a.m. at the Bear Lake State Park Arena. All proceeds from the event go to Primary Children's Medical Center. Gather your family and head north for a great cause. Visit bearlake.org for more information. Rich County, take the plunge.
Almost 45% of the oil produced in Utah, 7.8 million barrels, comes from Duchesne County. That oil feeds our state economy, provides job growth, and supports local business. Here in Duchesne County, we're working to make Utah an economic, cultural, and technological leader. Whether you're here for business or pleasure, Duchesne County will welcome you with open arms and invite you to explore all the beauty of the Uinta Mountains. Duchesne County, close enough for business, far enough to get away.
Rediscover your sense of adventure by attending the 16th Annual Bluff International Balloon Festival, January 17th through the 19th in Bluff, Utah. Visit us for some of the most beautiful, unencumbered red rock flying in the Southwest. Utah's San Juan County, where life is elevated.
Welcome back to the county seat. We are talking today with Brent Gardner, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Utah Association of Counties, an organization that you've been with for over 3 decades.
Yeah, 38 years almost.
Imagine stuff with, I mean, the functioning of counties. I'm trying to go back to 1976. You know, Salt Lake was still a commission form.
Right.
I think Swede Larson was still the sheriff back then.
Yeah.
That would be about the time George Catmull was one of the commissioners.
Mm-hmm.
So,
in fact, when I started in '76, there were no counties that had alternate forms like Salt Lake. Cache County was the first, which adopted a different form of government in 1985 when they went to a form that's similar to Salt Lake County. Now we have 6, but yeah, a lot of changes in those years.
What are some of the big highlights from a UAC perspective of the things that have made a big impact on counties or the organization?
Clearly, at the close to the top would be legislation that we adopted in 1997. We had, up to that point in time, always dealt with the problem of counties being solely funded on property tax. 90% or more of the revenues that every county was receiving back at that point in time came from a property tax that a homeowner pays or a small business pays on property that they own. That's very difficult to have one source of revenue. We funded some studies, did some research, found that most organizations, whether they're government, private, or whatever they are, function much better if they have at least 2 or 3 sources of revenue. so that you can kind of weather the ups and downs. And so we aggressively went after a new source, and we targeted sales tax.
I remember that controversy when it came up, and having been involved with the counties for the last 3 years, I've really changed my perspective on how this goes.
Yeah.
Was it a tough fight?
It was. The state, of course, was heavily funded by sales tax. Their major source of revenue is sales tax. Cities have a lot of sales tax revenue. When we first proposed it, it was sort of like, no, you can't get into sales tax. That's our source of revenue. We're sitting there thinking, why? Why is it exclusive to the state and to cities? Why not counties? So that was kind of our first big hurdle. And then we just have the anti-tax, we're not going to give you any more revenue mentality that you always have to deal with. But it took us 2 years, and we finally were able to trade. We had to do a trade-off, and we said, okay, if you'll give us a 1/4 cent of sales tax, we'll do a dollar for dollar reduction in property tax so that we're really changing sources and diversifying our base of revenues. And that's how we did it. And that was a big accomplishment, and it's proven to be very, very helpful for the counties now, as you can imagine, going through a lot of ups and downs in the economy, to have 2 sources that they can rely on as opposed to just be singly dependent on property tax. So that's a big issue. Redevelopment agencies, those are entities that most people don't even know exist, but they are created to fund new development in certain areas of a municipality, and we found that they were getting out of control and siphoning off revenues that counties really needed to operate. So we went through a number of years, different iterations of legislation, until we finally had something passed in about 1989 or so on redevelopment agencies. Elections is a big issue for counties. The legislature was very reluctant to open up new opportunities for registration, for early voting, for example, registration changes. So we've gone through a series of changes in the law to allow counties to administer elections, which we think are more beneficial to the citizen who wants to vote. And then, of course, jail funding and
yeah, we only cover that about, what, 5 times a year on
law
the show.
enforcement. That's a big issue. So those are some legislative issues that we've dealt with that we think have been very, very successful. At the federal level, we were successful, of course, with not on our own. We had to join forces with other states, but in the early 1980s, the federal government adopted what's called payment in lieu of taxes, where they're reimbursing counties for providing services on federal lands. Up until that time, counties were really funding a lot of those services without any revenue, and so that program came into existence, and over the years we've had to fight to get it funded, and we now have it fully funded by the federal government, and that's a big revenue source for county government.
At least we think. You know, I've been talking just in the last week with several counties who are not sure they're going to get pilled in the future. Well,
they're talking this year about a reduction, of course, because of sequestration and other things that are occurring at the federal level. Yeah, so we may have to go back and revisit that whole funding question with the federal government, but clearly a big, big issue. And we were successful in the 1980s in getting the state to adopt a similar program to pay state payment in lieu of taxes to counties for providing services to state lands as well. So again, a couple of big accomplishments there that the association's been through. And kind of the final category would be the things that we've done internal to the organization. When I started, there were really just myself and another full-time employee and one secretary. The legislature has grown exponentially. I think they have in the neighborhood of 40 or 50 staff people drafting legislation and doing legal work. At the time I started, there was only 1 or 2. So you can see how that's grown, and so our staff has tried to keep up. We now have about 10 employees, and our conventions and our meeting responsibilities have all grown as well. We have large numbers of people now participating in our legislative policy process and adopting those, and getting active in the process that we go through to develop those positions and those legislative issues. So we've expanded our reach into areas beyond just elected officials, not just the sheriff or the commissioner or the attorney now. We've fostered participation by information technology directors, planning and zoning directors, human resource directors. And about 5 years ago, we merged our organization with an organization that was representing the mental health and substance abuse directors for the counties. And there's a lot of money flowing through the federal government to the counties to provide mental health and substance abuse services. And the policymakers at the county level, the elected officials, felt like it would be advantageous to combine those two organizations. So they merged, and they are now a very large part of what we do at the county, at the Association of County level, in representing mental health and substance abuse as well. So a lot of big changes internally in terms of the size and scope of what we do just as a staff for and behalf of our elected officials and our appointed officials.
I sit here and think about all the things that you're talking about. You have to be an expert on so many subjects. I don't know how you do it.
Yeah, counties have a lot of responsibility. The scope of their duties and responsibilities is very large. So we do touch on a lot of those things. I don't know if I'm an expert in a lot of those areas, but I certainly have a little bit of knowledge about a lot of things that they are involved in. And it's helpful because from year to year you need to kind of remember and be engaged in various aspects of it. So I agree. There's a lot of responsibility upon county government that we try to become familiar with and represent them.
Well, we're going to take a break here on the county seat. When we come back, we're going to get out the crystal ball and peer into the next legislative session and maybe perhaps a couple of broader issues. Stay with us on the county seat. We'll be right back.
Skiing is expensive, right? Well, how about we do something about that? Eagle Point, Southern Utah's premier resort located right outside of Beaver, Utah, is proud to announce $25 lift tickets all season long. Ski and snowboard Utah's newest resort for the lowest price, and find out why the Point, with its family-friendly staff and great atmosphere, will become your second home. $25 lift passes all season. Go to eaglepointresort.com for eligibility and restrictions. 5 lifts, 40 named runs, 1,500 vertical feet. Endless possibilities. Eagle Point Resort.
So, what brings you to town?
What brings anyone to St. George? A couple rounds of golf, a little relaxation.
What is that all?
Is there more? In a retirement community? Should have stuck with the back 9.
How would you spend an extra day in Utah Valley? Stay one more day. Visit utahvalley.com to make reservations. Utah Valley. Bring everyone together.
Welcome back to the county seat. We've been having a conversation with Brent Gardner from the Utah Association of Counties. Brent, recently I saw in the Deseret News an article, it was front page, that said asked the question, does the state, and hence the counties, rely too much on the federal government for funding? Obviously, counties at this time with sequestration and some of the other events that are going on, and even many of the rural counties expressing concern that the federal government may not be able to meet its obligations on an ongoing basis. How big of a red flag is that on the horizon for UAC?
Well, it's big, and I'd break it into 2 parts. One part of that has to do with the financial and budget crisis, if you term it that way, at the federal level in terms of whether or not they can continue to fund and meet their obligations.
I would call it budget neglect itself.
Yeah, and of course if that is interrupted, that flow of revenue from the federal government down to the counties, then it has a big impact because counties are at the end of the pipeline. I mean, the federal government puts it in, it flows through the pipe, through the state, ends up at the county takes it out, provides services. For example, some of those that I mentioned, human services like mental health and substance abuse. Clearly, if that funding were cut off or reduced significantly, there would be a lot of citizens that would suffer because of that. They wouldn't have the services that they're getting now. And I doubt the counties have the resources to really pick up the level of service that the federal government is funding at this time. So that's one category. It could be human services, as I mentioned. It could be law enforcement. It could be highways. I mean, there's a lot of federal money coming in. But the other side of that question is, how do you not be dependent when 70% in some cases statewide is the number, but in other cases 97% of your land is owned by the federal government? So perfect example, shutdown of the federal government and the closing of the national parks. How do you avoid that? How do you prepare for that? Well, the counties are prepared to pick up some of it, but if the federal government truly ceases to operate, there is a big impact that's felt, and I don't believe counties are in a position to really take over. What we've started to do, take over those functions, what we started to do now is do some planning and say, okay, what if we go through this again? What authority do we need at the county level to start shutting off some of these services and functions and reducing our expenditure levels to meet the revenues that we have? So we're going through some of that now to kind of anticipate that that wasn't a one-time event.
The Transfer of Public Lands Act has been very controversial in the state of Utah, and I recall at the Rural Summit in Cedar City earlier this year, Doug Wright spoke, and he called it crazy talk. Do the rural counties of the state necessarily think that that is crazy talk?
I think it's more like wishful thinking. It would really be an ideal opportunity if the federal government were to do it. How many of them really believe it's going to happen, I don't know. I was in a meeting yesterday with some different organizations, mining, oil and gas, electrical, conservation districts and others. And that subject came up, and the question was, do you really think the federal government's just going to hand over land? And of course most people would say no. But on the other hand, the point is that they have treated Utah differently than they've treated other states. I just don't know where that's going to really lead. We have to, of course, try to push a lot of issues simultaneously. That's one. We've got a lot of things out there that we're doing to try and deal with the same issues.
What is the big target legislatively? What sits ahead in the next 90 days?
Prison relocation, I mentioned to you earlier, that's a big issue because it's so far-reaching in terms of its budget impact, and the function of law enforcement is the largest expenditure at county government levels. So it impacts a lot of what we do. We're truly going to have to be involved in that. Highway funding is another big issue. The expansion of Medicaid is another issue that we're watching closely. A lot of the election laws are still tracking very closely, and tax issues. There are going to be some tax issues. We already heard from one legislator yesterday who wants to propose a change in sales tax structure.
Thanks again for joining us here today.
Thank you.
Okay, we will look for you next week on the county seat, starting a new season, and we hope that you will get involved because local government is where your life happens. We'll see you next week.